السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله وحبيبه، بلغ الرسالة وأدى الأمانة ونصح الأمة، فكشف الله به الغمة، وتركنا على المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم: يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, O you who believe, fear and be conscious of Allah as He should be feared, and do not die except in a total state of submission to Him and Him only, Jalla Jalaluh. Amma ba'd, brothers and sisters, when the Muslims made hijrah from Mecca to Medina, they left everything they owned behind. And when Quraysh, they knew about this, they were not happy at all. They disapproved, to say the very, very least. And when they got to Medina, the Muslims, they posed as a threat to Quraysh, right? To them, having a Muslim state is a direct threat. And to add on, right, they can't, their oppression and their persecution, it can't reach the Muslims if they're in another city. Again, remember, the Muslims that lived in Medina the first couple of years after Ba'tha, they were tortured, they were humiliated, they were persecuted, and some were even killed. Right, so now Quraysh has no access to these Muslims. But they did everything in their power to bother the Muslims in Medina. So for instance, they would send small forces, and these forces, they would line up in front of Medina to intimidate the Muslims. Now the Muslims, the Prophet ﷺ, he would send the same amount of men to go stand in front of them, to make a statement that we're not scared of you, right? And ultimately, no fighting happened. And then Quraysh took it a step further in another instance where they burned a farm in the outskirts of Medina that belonged to a Muslim. And as a result of this, a Muslim died inside that farm. So Quraysh, they did not want the Muslims to live in peace whatsoever. And they wanted them to live in fear like they did in Mecca. So the Prophet ﷺ, to fight back against this intimidation, he had a plan. He had a plan where he took 313 Muslim men, and they were going to intercept a large caravan that was going from Medina to Bilad al-Sham. And that caravan was being led by Abu Sufyan. This was before he became a Muslim. And now, usually, when caravans, they would go out from Medina to Bilad al-Sham, to the Levant, they would pass by Medina. From Mecca to the Levant, they would pass by Medina. So it's extremely easy for the Muslims to have an intersection point where they intercept this caravan and they take their goods. They hurt Quraysh. And a big part of Quraysh's economy was based on these trades, brothers and sisters. So they would take whatever goods they have, they would go to the Levant, they would sell it or trade it and come back with more wealth. So not this interception that is going to happen by the Muslims will not only tell Quraysh to back off, but it will also make a statement in the rest of Arabia that the Muslim presence should be known, right? So this tactic, it had a lot of benefits to the Muslims. Not to mention, the Muslims, they would get their wealth back that they left in Medina. So this tactic devised by our beloved Habib sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it had a lot of benefits in the favor of the Muslims. So these 313 Muslim men, they set out in Ramadan to intercept this large caravan as soon as it took off from Medina. And when they got to the intersection point, they waited and waited and waited, no one came. So they missed the caravan. So they said, Khair, let's go back, we'll intercept it when it's coming back from Bilad al-Sham. But unfortunately, Abu Sufyan, he received news that the Muslims were plotting something. And the Muslims tried to intercept his caravan. So in all of his wisdom, he was a very smart leader. He sent news to Mecca right away. And he told them to prepare an army. And on his way back from Bilad al-Sham, instead of taking the usual route where he passes by Medina, he completely took a different route and avoided the Muslims entirely. So then when he set out from Bilad al-Sham, the Muslims, they wanted to intercept this caravan, right? So they went to the intersection point and no one showed up. So they thought to themselves, Ya Rabbi, we missed it again. Khalas, no problem. They were getting ready, packing their bags. They wanted to go back home to Medina until a scout came to the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, and he told everyone, Ya Rasulullah, Quraysh has an army and they're headed towards us in a day, day and a half, maybe 2 days time, right? And he said that the army that is on its way consisted of 1,000 men. 1,000 men. While the Muslims, they only had 313. The army that was coming and it was on its way was fully equipped with armor, with weapons, with horses. They were fully equipped for war. While the Muslims, on the other hand, they were only there to intercept a caravan, right? So they didn't have access to whatever Quraysh had access to. And not to mention, during that time, in that specific moment, the state of the Muslims, they were poor. They migrated not too long ago, and the Ansar had to split their wealth with the Muhajirin. So the Muslim state was not at its best, and they did not have weapons, and they did not have the luxuries that Quraysh had. And not to mention, the army that was on its way, they were well fed and well nourished. But the Muslims, they were fasting. It was Ramadan, right? So this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He talks about this in the Quran, and He introduces this story in Surah Al-Anfal, and He says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وإذ يعدكم الله إحدى الطائفتين إنها لكم وتودون أن غير ذات الشوكة تكون لكم ويريد الله أن يحق الحق بكلماته ويقطع دابر الكافرين. He says, remember, O believers, when Allah promised to give you the upper hand over either target. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He told the believers that one of two things is bound to happen. Either they go out and they capture this caravan and they don't fight, they take the spoils and the wealth and the money and they go back to Medina. Or he says, you will confront the Meccans, the Quraysh, and you will go into battle with them. And then he says, you wish to capture the unarmed party. Allah is saying that the believers, their wish and their hopes was that they would go intercept this caravan, they would take all the wealth and everything and go back to Medina with no fighting at all. But then Allah says, but Allah wanted to establish the truth through His words and to cut off the very root of the disbelievers. And then He continues and He says, لِيُحِقَّ الْحَقَّ وَيُبْطِلَ الْبَاطِلَ وَلَوْ كَرِهَ الْمُجْرِمُونَ, to firmly establish the truth and to wipe out falsehood even to the dismay of the wicked. Right? So the Muslims, they had a plan. The Muslims, they had a plan, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had another, and His plan will always prevail, Jalla Jalaluh. So after receiving the news, the Prophet ﷺ, he talked with his men, and he asked them for their advice. He took their shura. And one companion, he said to Rasulullah, he said, Ya Rasulullah, imdi lima amaraka rabbuk, imdi lima amaraka Allah, fanahnu ma'ak. He says, do whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded you to do, because wallahi, and indeed we are right behind you, Ya Rasulullah. We're always with you. Right? So then the Prophet ﷺ, he said this. He says, Siru wa abshiru, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ وَعَدَنِي إِحْدَى الطَّائِفَتَيْنِ. He says, march forward and give glad tidings, for Allah has promised me either of the two events. Right? Either they intercept the caravan or they face off with Quraysh. And then he says something extremely powerful. He says, Wallahi, لَكَأَنِّي الْآنَ أَنظُرُ إِلَى مَصَارِعِ الْقَوْمِ. He says, by Allah, it is as though I can see the places in where the enemy will be killed. Allahu Akbar. So that was a big bishara to the Muslims. Big bushra to the Muslims. So then they went out and they set out and they reached the battlefield in an area called Badr. And they prepared to confront Quraysh on the spot. And right before the battle, the night before the battle, again this was Ramadan, all of the Muslims in the camp, they were all praying to Allah for His help and His aid. And specifically the Prophet ﷺ, he was seen on his knees with his hands stretched out to the sky. Usually when the Prophet ﷺ would make dua, he would make it like this, with his hand next to his or adjacent from his chest. But this time his hands were stretched out to the sky and he was calling out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, Ya Allah, accomplish me what you have promised me. Ya Rabb, bring your promise to life. And then he says, Ya Allah, if this group of believers, they disappear and they die, there will be no one left to worship you on this earth like you deserve to be worshipped. And he made dua in such an intense manner that his beard started soaking wet and his chest started soaking wet as well. And then his cloak eventually fell off from his shoulder. And that's when Sayyidina Abu Bakr, our master Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he sees this. And he goes to the Prophet ﷺ and he puts the Prophet's cloak on his beloved shoulders. And he says, Ya Rasulullah, Allah has heard your prayers. Allah has heard you. He will surely answer you. And in that moment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He revealed the next ayah in Surah Al-Anfal, where He told the Prophet ﷺ, He says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, إذ تستغيثون ربكم فاستجاب لكم أني ممدكم بألف من الملائكة مردفين. He says, remember when you cried out to your Lord in worship, He answered. And what did Allah's answer say? I will reinforce you with 1,000 angels, one following the other. So the Prophet ﷺ, out of happiness, he went into the camp and he started reciting, سَيُهْزَمُ الْجَمْعُ وَيُوَلُّونَ الدُّبُرِ. Their assembly will be defeated and they will turn their backs in retreat. And everyone had hope in Allah Jalla Jalaluh. And so the next day came and the Prophet ﷺ, he lined up the Muslim army, he gave them their positions and he told them what to do. Right? They're doing their part. And then Quraysh came and the confrontation happened and the battle begun. And only then Allah's promise came true, where He reinforced the Muslims with thousands of angels. And brothers and sisters, subhanAllah, there are countless stories of Sahaba who witnessed this miracle firsthand. For instance, one Sahabi, he says, I slashed my sword in the air and an enemy that was, 5, 6, 7, 10 feet away from me got slashed. How? I don't know. Another Sahabi, he says, I was chasing after one of the disbelievers, and right when I got, as soon as I was able to catch up to him, I heard a whip-like sound from the sky, and I heard angels talking, and then the disbeliever, he fell. And when I came to check on him, I saw that he had a big wound next to his eye. And another Sahabi, he brought a prisoner to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet and this prisoner, he says, this man, and he started describing this man that wasn't even in the battlefield. He says, this man captured me. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, no, an angel captured you, because angels were there to help. So this miracle was experienced by many, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He aided them. He aided them, and He granted them a swift victory that changed the trajectory of Islam and the state of the Muslim Ummah. Because brothers and sisters, this was the first major battle in Islam, the Battle of Badr. Right? It was 313 men against 1,000. Now think about this if from a outsider's perspective, right? 300 men versus 1,000? 300 men versus 1,000? If this was to happen today, all the bets would go to the 1,000 people, right? So the fact that these 313 men defeated the 1,000 says a lot. It already says a lot. And it was very well known, right? Quraysh was a very well known tribe. The Muslims were the underdogs. And Quraysh was a very famous tribe in Arabia. They had their presence, but the Muslims did not. So in defeating them, in this victory, the Muslim presence was known throughout Arabia. The Muslims, no one can mess around with the Muslims, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He makes mention of this victory in Surah Ali Imran, where He says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ولقد نصركم الله ببدر وأنتم أذلة فاتقوا الله لعلكم تشكرون. He says, indeed, Allah made you victorious at Badr when you were weak. وأنتم أذلة. You had no weapons, you had no men, you had nothing, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gave you victory. So be mindful of Allah, perhaps you will be grateful, right? The Muslims, they were weak, they were outnumbered, they were outgunned, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He supported them, He aided them, and He granted them victory. And subhanAllah, when we analyze the events that happened, we see that this first started off with the Muslims planning to do something. Right? They planned to intercept a caravan. They set their intentions to it. And then they trusted Allah. And then they went out to intercept. But then Allah had a different plan. So then the Muslims had to readjust to what Allah planned. And then they trusted Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again. And then they did their part again. And then the promise of Allah came to life. And victory was granted to them. So the key to victory, brothers and sisters, is having unbreakable tawakkul in Allah. They had unbreakable tawakkul no matter what they were going through. Ya Rabbi, I'm going to intercept a caravan and I'm not going to fight. Okay, tawakkalna ala Allah. We went out. Oh, Ya Rabbi, you had a different plan. We're fighting an army of 1,000 men. No problem. Tawakkalna ala Allah. And look at how Allah's promise came to life. And having tawakkul in Allah, having full trust in Allah, Jalla Jalaluh, brothers and sisters, in everything that we do, wallahi, it is one of the most beautiful concepts. Beautiful concepts, right? Because it always ends up in the favor of the believer. Wallahi, it always ends up in the favor of the believer, as we learn from the Battle of Badr and many different scenarios in our Prophet's life and many different parables in the Quran that teach the same lesson, tawakkul. Right? Take for example Prophet Musa alayhi salam with Fir'aun. Take for example Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam with his qawm and with the fire and with his father, and then later on in his life with his wife and his son. Take Maryam alayhi salam and the birth of Prophet Isa and her going back to show her people, Prophet Isa, take Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, where he was trapped inside a well, and then later down his life, he was imprisoned. Take Prophet Yunus alayhi salam in the whale. Take Prophet Nuh alayhi salam in the flood. Many, many different scenarios where tawakkul was a key component. Tawakkul was exercised, right? And the person having that tawakkul in Allah Jalla Jalaluh ended up victorious. Wallahi, they ended up victorious. The Prophet ﷺ, he was once asked, Ya Rasulullah, very famous hadith, should I tie my camel and trust in Allah? Or should I leave her untied and trust in Allah? So Prophet ﷺ, he says, tie her and trust in Allah. Tie your camel and trust in Allah. But what this hadith teaches us is there are two major steps that we must take before initiating tawakkul, before having trust in Allah. The first is a goal, is an intention, right? There is always a goal that we want to achieve, whether it may be knowledge, a degree, getting a job, getting married, etc., 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 right? And the next step is doing your part. The next step is doing your part. Prophet ﷺ says, tie your camel. Go do action. Do something, right? Do your part. Whatever step is necessary to achieve the goal, do it. And part of that step, or something that we must include in this step, is making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because this is a major component of doing your part. And then finally is the tawakkul part. Have tawakkul. Set out an intention. Do your part and trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and wait for His decree, because wallahi, brothers and sisters, Allah's decree will always be good for us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who always put their trust in Him جل جلاله. وأقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فيا فوز المستغفرين استغفر الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد, brothers and sisters, our scholars, they divided people into three categories in terms of their approach to tawakkul. Our scholars, they say the first type of people are those who rely on Allah. They rely on Allah without personally putting any effort towards the end goal themselves. So someone, he wants to travel, he or she wants to travel. They set out with no money, no extra clothing, no means of transportation, nothing at all. And they say to themselves and to everyone, I have my intention, I want to travel to this place, one way or another, I know Allah will take care of me. Astaghfirullah al-Azim. What do you mean Allah will take care of you? Okay, you have to do your part, right? This is tawakkul, this is not tawakkul. This is laziness, it is not tawakkul. And they say the second are those who take the means to achieve the desired outcome while relying solely on those means and not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right, so this might be someone who is sick, they take medicine and they put their full trust and their full hope in that medicine without thinking about Allah. Wal-'ayadhu billah. This is ignorance. This is not tawakkul. And they say the third are those who take the means to achieve the desired outcome while relying on Allah Jalla Jalaluh. So a student, for example, he has a test, an exam coming up, and he studies all night and all day, and then he turns to Allah and says, Ya Rabbi, please make me pass this exam. This is tawakkul. This is true tawakkul. To set the intention on doing something, actually doing your part, and then leaving the rest up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ibn Ata'illah, he once said, relieve yourself of worry after you have planned. Do not concern yourself with what Allah has undertaken on your behalf. Do your part, tawakkal ala Allah, and just leave it. Because brothers and sisters, sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has something else planned for us. Like we saw in the battle of Badr. Sometimes we have goals. We have a path that we want to take. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has other plans. And only His plan will prevail. And only His plan will be implemented. Right? Sometimes we don't have it our way. And that is completely normal. But we have to have full yaqeen and full certainty that whatever Allah decrees for us is what is best for us. Of course, after we did our part and after we have tawakkul in Him. And trusting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, having tawakkul in Him comes by knowing Him, Jalla Jalaluh. Right? This is Allah we are talking about. This is Al-Wakil, Al-Qareeb, Al-Ra'uf, Al-Rahim, Al-Rahman, Al-Awwal, Al-Akhir, right? Al-Kareem. This is Allah. This is He who blesses us. He who is our provider, our protector, our sustainer, Jalla Jalaluh. So you want to strengthen your trust? Know Him. Go read about Him. Learn about Him, right? And we must have a good opinion of Him, and we must trust Him more than we trust our own selves. And Ramadan, brothers and sisters, Ramadan, less than 10 days away, is a golden opportunity to strengthen this trust that we have in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because many of us right now, we might be worried that we won't have the ability to make the most of our Ramadans, right? Due to the limitations that we have. Right, we want to pray more, we want to read Quran more, we want to give charity more, we want to spend time with Allah more. But then these dunyawi things, they pop up. Work, school, obligations, lack of money sometimes, etc., etc. And then we start asking ourselves, طيب, what if I can't wake up for tahajjud due to my workload and my work schedule? Right? What if I can't read or have time to read Quran because of my obligations? What if I can't go to Taraweeh because of my schoolwork? And all of these questions, brothers and sisters, are extremely valid concerns that we must address and we must resolve. And the solution to this is to follow in the path of the righteous and to follow in the path of the 313 men who were facing 1,000 well-armed men. And that is to have a good intention, number one. And number two, to do our parts. And number three is to trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Have the intention of doing good in Ramadan. Have that intention, Ya Rabbi, this Ramadan I'm going to change for the better. And I'm going to read more Quran. And I'm going to pray more. And I'm going to stay up in tahajjud more. And then make a plan. Make a plan, brothers and sisters. Do your part. Start preparing from now. Alhamdulillah, Ramadan is not tomorrow. Right? It is not tomorrow. It is, more or less in a week from now. So use this week to plan out how you're going to spend every hour in Ramadan. And work around your work schedules, your school schedules, whatever obligations that you might have. Do your part. And then leave the rest up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Leave the rest up to Him and have that trust in Him, Jalla Jalaluh. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless our Rajab and Sha'ban and allow us to reach Ramadan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from those who have full trust in Him at all times and in all situations in our lives. Allahumma barik lana fi Rajab wa Sha'ban wa ballighna Ramadan. Allahumma barik lana fi Rajab wa Sha'ban وبلغنا رمضان اللهم بارك لنا في رجب وشعبان وبلغنا رمضان اللهم اغفر لنا وارحمنا وعافنا واعف عنا وتجاوز عن سيئاتنا اللهم إنا نسألك رضاك والجنة ونعوذ بك من عذاب النار وعذاب القبر اللهم إنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين اللهم لا تجعلنا من الخاسرين ولا تجعلنا من المنافقين ولا تجعلنا من المتكبرين واجعلنا يا ربي من أوليائك الصالحين واجعلنا من المتقين واجعلنا من المحسنين واجعلنا من الذين يتوكلون عليك دائما يا رب العالمين اللهم كن مع إخواننا المستضعفين في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها كن معهم ولا تكن عليهم انصرهم ولا تنصر عليهم وصل اللهم على سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وأقم الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
لا إله إلا الله دائما أبدا لا إله إلا الله استقيموا وتراصوا يرحمني ويرحمكم الله. Foot to foot, shoulder to shoulder, do not leave any gaps. Pray as if you're praying your last and final prayer. Allahu Akbar. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لإيلاف قريش إيلافهم رحلة الشتاء والصيف فليعبدوا رب هذا البيت الذي أطعمهم من جوع وآمنهم من خوف. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.